A little bit later, Matt will be leading us in another sermon on Hebrews. I think we're coming towards the end of the Hebrews sessions. I'm going to read now from Hebrews chapter 11 and into verse 12. So some random verses, and there they are, the ones I'm going to read. Now, faith is the certainty of things hoped for, a proof of things not seen. For by it the people of old gained approval. By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he left not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as a stranger in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, even from one man, and one who was as good as dead at that, there were born descendants, who were just as the stars of heaven in number, and as the innumerable grains of sand along the seashore. All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen and welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country which they left, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mocking and flogging, and further chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins, in goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, people of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts, on mountains, and sheltering in caves and holes in the ground. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. Therefore, since we also have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let's rid ourselves of every obstacle and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let's run with endurance the race that is set before us. Looking only at Jesus, the originator and perfecter of the faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart.
Morning, everyone. Again, let me extend a warm welcome to our Sunday morning service. It's great to have you with us. My name is Matt, just in case we don't know each other, and I'm one of the leaders here at Margate Christian Church. And this morning, in case you haven't guessed, we're going to be talking about primarily the topic, the issue of faith. Faith. And primarily, I think it'd be safe to say, why faith? Why faith? And there's a couple of reasons why this is such an important thing to cover. Like the first thing is that faith as a term, as a religious term, is just so much at risk, I think, of becoming a buzzword, a piece of jargon, a cliche, if you like, that people think, as in religious people think, they're so familiar with, and everyone kind of agrees on what they mean, but no one actually gets clarity on it. So it's very easy for different people to think they're all thinking the same thing, they have the same meaning when it comes to faith, when in reality they could be on very, very different kind of pages. So for the sake of trying to bust through a buzzword and unpack it and get clarity, that's a good sound reason to look at the subject of faith. It can just cause so much confusion. I found I was half tempted to call this sermon faith the other F word, but then I thought better of it, so just left that behind. That's like the first reason. The second reason is, if you're not a Christian here, if you don't identify as Christian, you may be wondering, what's the point of even like looking at faith, because it's a specifically religious concept. You've got no concern about it unless you identify as being Christian or religious. But I came across this book the other day, study it for school, for the study that I'm undertaking. It was written by a couple of non-religious, I think they'd probably identify as spiritual, but non-religious psychologists and researchers. And they've been studying this idea of what they call spiritual struggles for decades now, spiritual struggles. And they kind of define a spiritual struggle as being something that you don't choose. So it's not a kind of suffering or struggle that you choose. It's not the equivalent of signing up for a triathlon or maybe doing some intermittent fasting or getting rid of one of your streaming services. It's involuntary suffering. It's something that is thrust upon you, and it is profound. It may involve suffering. It may involve encountering evil for the first time. It's something that turns your whole world upside down, beyond your control, where you start to question your place in the universe. And also who's in control, what is guiding you, what is the meaning and the point of your life. This is a spiritual struggle. And the really startling thing was that they've surveyed thousands of people across different countries now around this idea of spiritual struggles, and found, I think, upwards of 75% of respondents identified as having experienced some kind of spiritual struggle. And that's regardless of whether they were religious or not. Everyone eventually, over time, if you live long enough, the wheel will turn, and you are highly likely to suffer something like this that quantifies as a spiritual struggle. That's the first thing. The second really interesting part of that research that they've done is that when people go through any kind of trial or struggle, whether it's big time spiritual or something smaller, we all kind of fall back on what they call coping mechanisms. And health professionals seem to kind of categorise these along a spectrum of healthy or optimal coping mechanisms, good diet, good exercise, family and friends, that kind of stuff, to suboptimal or not so ideal coping mechanisms, having a six-pack for breakfast, eating really badly, binging too much TV over here. So there's a spectrum of coping mechanisms. And these guys found that there's a category of coping mechanisms which they call religious coping. And this involves things such as being part of a religious community or a spiritual community, attending like regular meetings, and having that kind of spiritual camaraderie. And it also includes having what they call an integrated perspective. And that is, religion or spirituality seems to be the only mechanism, if you like, that we've got so far as humans that helps integrate everything that happens in our entire lives, holistically, including pain and suffering and struggles. And it somehow manages to put, if you like, our present suffering into a greater long-term whole, which is another way of saying what we often believe from a religious perspective about the future helps make sense of the hard things we could be suffering here in the present. And the conclusion of the study is found is that although there are all these other good ways of coping with struggles and pain, they haven't found anything that replaces, that's a substitute for this good, healthy religious coping, which is amazing. So just think about that. The way that we think about the future, how we make sense of the future, what we think, what we hope for the future, as Alan was saying before, will have these very real consequences on how we make sense of our present, and particularly if that's difficult and tough. And that is why I think faith matters, regardless of where you are on the spectrum of spirituality. Okay? So there's going to be hopefully something for everyone in this talk. So looking at faith. Some of this, as you've already picked up from the passages that we heard, some of this involves going through what really amounts to thousands of years of Jewish history. So that long passage that we only heard some excerpts of, that's covering a span of thousands of years in Jewish history. It's all quite culturally specific. It'd make a lot more, I suppose, surface level sense if we were Jewish or we were closer to the date of writing, so we have to spend a bit more time interpreting it. And I'm not going to obviously lie or try to cover for it. It's a pretty mysterious world, okay, that we're kind of looking at. It seems so archaic to us, but we're going to try to make as much sense of it as we can today, okay? So, faith. I want to start off by coming up with a rough definition that'll get more and more defined and refined over the course of this passage of what faith is. So we're going to build a definition. That's what we're hoping to do today. I want to build a gradual definition of faith from this particular chapter, from Hebrews 11. And then I want to wrap up by looking at some of the implications this may have for our different real lives. It's a long passage, and there are so many and great examples of faith that we aren't going to have time to unpack today because of our time constraints, but we will see some common themes across these examples. The author has carefully put together 3 sections of examples, characters from the Old Testament, again Jewish history, of what it means, examples of what it means to live by faith, with the idea that it was going to be a big shot in the arm of encouragement for his readers. This is a who's who of people who haven't shrunk back, as we looked at last week, haven't shrunk back from following God, but are living by faith. So that's where we're going. So we're going to start off with verse 1. So if you've got your Bibles, please crack them open to Hebrews 11, verse 1, and we'll start trying to answer this question, what's faith? And it's important to get clarity on this, like I've already said. The phrase, by faith, just that phrase alone, by faith, occurs 18 times between verses 3 and 31 of this chapter. And funnily enough, it's not found anywhere else in this book, that phrase, by faith. So 18 times, so it's high rotation. And this is how it starts. Faith is the certainty of things hoped for, a proof of things not seen. For by it the people of old gained approval. Now, first of all, it's important to say this isn't going to be a dictionary definition of what is meant by faith. It's not going to be technical. It's not going to be exhaustive. There are other angles on what faith means that we can find in other parts of Scripture. So this is all in the context of Hebrews 11. It's not meant to be exhaustive. It's not meant to be technical. But it is a good explanation, a really good and thorough explanation of what faith is when you are in the trenches of real life. In the trenches of real life. So look at that verse again. Faith is the certainty of things hoped for. This sounds a lot like what people have called an objective definition of faith. So it has the object of faith in mind. So very, very importantly, this isn't just faith for faith's sake. It's not just faith for faith's sake. And the object of faith here are these things that are hoped for. And we'll come back to that later, the things that are hoped for. But you'll see that already it has a future-oriented sense, a future focus. Second, it's the certainty of things hoped for, the certainty. And this is a really strong word, certainty. It's also a here and now word, a word about the present, not the past and not the future. So faith involves being certain here and now about something that is going to occur in the future. And this is interesting, I think, because from that you can see that what we think and expect about the future, again, is going to impact in a really profound way our current reality. So that is, in the here and now, what we think about the future is going to impact our present. The future influences the present. And we'll see that that seems to be the case across all the examples that we're presented with here in chapter 11. So just to stop there for a second, if this idea of faith is correct, a certainty in the here and now, that a particular great thing is going to happen in the future, then that is different. That is importantly different from faith being just hopeful or optimistic feelings about vague or general good things that God may do in the future. It's different from that. It's more certain than this. It's more specific in its object than this. This idea of faith that we're talking about is a bit stronger and specific. It's being pretty convinced now that this specific good thing is going to happen then. And you see that in the second half of that first verse. A proof of things not seen. A proof, a guarantee, if you like, of things not seen. Again, that's strong language. And when it's referring to things not seen, it's not talking about the unseen, invisible spiritual realm. It means things not yet seen in our time. It's talking about the future again. Again, faith involves a future focus. So we're starting to get our definition together, and we find out a little bit more about it in verses 5 to 6. So chapter 11, verse 5 to 6. So again, Enoch, and this is like Enoch, an old, ancient Old Testament character, thousands of years back. Enoch, was attested to having been pleasing to God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him, that is God. For the one who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he proves to be one who rewards those who seek him. So, we're finding out more about faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Why? Because you've got to believe that he exists. Well, yeah, but you'd almost think that's a given. Perhaps more specifically, as one commentator has argued, it translates more accurately for the context to believe that not so much God just exists, but to believe that God is faithful. That God is faithful. And God's going to prove his faithfulness by rewarding those who seek him. Again, this is really interesting. Faith, being certain now about the future hope and living in that reality, is indicative of whether we believe that God is who he says he is. Powerful, loving. Do you believe that God is who he says that he is, powerful and loving? Do you trust him? Because without that trust, without actually believing, being convicted that God is faithful, it's impossible to please him. And once again, it seems to boil down to this at heart comes down to a relationship between God, the Creator, and humans, his creatures. Do we trust our Creator? Do we actually have faith that he is who he says that he is, loving and powerful? And look also at that line, that God is going to reward those who seek him. And seek him, this is like earnestly seek him, diligently seek him. And again, this strikes me as being primarily relational. On a human level, if you're really into someone, if you're committed to a relationship with another human, you're going to be consistently, intentionally trying to find more and more about them. You won't be satisfied with just like the shallow or the surface. You want to know all of them. And that alone, just like plumbing the depths of another human being, getting to know them as much as possible, that could easily be your life's work. You could spend an entire lifetime really getting to know someone. Okay, that's a start on what faith is. A certainty, a conviction we can feel in the present about a future hope that is so strong it shapes our reality in the here and now. And by extension, it reflects a belief, a trust that we have in God, our Creator. And we find out again more about it by looking at verse 8 in chapter 11. So now we're going to turn to the Old Testament hero, Abraham, for some inspiration. So again, early ancient Jewish history. By faith, Abraham, when he was called by God, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he left, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as a stranger in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs, descendants of the same promise. For he, Abraham, was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So Abraham, way back when, in early Genesis, hears this call from God. And this call is a future-focused promise. And the promise we can read about in Genesis, it involves land. It involves having many descendants. It involves being blessed, as in material abundance at that time. And that promise, that call, was enough of a conviction for Abraham that it affected his present reality. He left home, not knowing where he was going, and he became a tent dweller. So there's a certain impermanence there. His living situation was always temporary because he was looking and waiting for the city. So the city, permanent, stable, solid with foundations, as opposed to tents. And this city, its designer, its architect, we read, was God. So Abraham leaves his home, presumably with that his extended family networks, his culture, everything that he knew was probably so much of a bigger deal back then than now, and oriented his entire life around this certainty that this promised future would eventuate. That's gutsy. That is true conviction. Or maybe it's foolhardy, depending upon your perspective. And look how it ended in verse 13. All these being Abraham and co, died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen and welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country which they left, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Abraham died without receiving the promises. But he didn't die bitter. He didn't die angry or disappointed. The Greek term there that is translated welcomed, it means literally to anticipate with pleasure, to look forward with happiness to what was going to happen. So this is also worth noting. Abraham's faith, his conviction about this glorious future city, it wasn't just cognitive, it wasn't just heady, it wasn't just a belief that he held. It wasn't less than that, but it was also more. He anticipated it with pleasure, a feeling, pleasure. In verse 14, that line, seeking a country of their own, it's absolutely emphatic. So this seeking, it's not just kind of like neutral seeking, this seeking has desire behind it. They're looking for this country, they're seeking for this country because they want it. They really, really want it. And then in verse 16 we read they desire a better country. So really importantly, faith, our definition of faith that we're building, it's holistic. It doesn't end with just intellectual assent. Instead, it involves our emotions. It helps shape our desires. At the risk of offering a really lame parallel, it's not just, I know Christmas is coming, but more, I can't wait for Christmas to come. That's the difference. That's the difference. In verse 16, we again hear mention of this heavenly city that God has prepared for them. And we've hit this theme of God rewarding those who seek him, who trust him, etc. again. So God is going to give those people who earnestly seek him, he's going to give them what they desire and what they are looking for. He's going to reward that. And look how this faith affected Abraham and his descendants as they viewed their present reality. They regarded themselves as strangers and exiles on earth. They desired a better country. So this future promise, it was so desirable and so enticing, it shaped the way they viewed, and not only viewed, but how they felt about their present, their current age back then, their life. It wasn't their ultimate home. And I find this particularly interesting in Abraham's case, because despite being nomadic and constantly having to set up tents, we also read of him being wealthy and successful at the time. Abraham was living his best life, so to speak, as in the best life you could probably have and possess back then. Flocks, herds, big family, lots of staff, power and security. And let me stress, there's nothing wrong with any of that stuff. So when it comes to talking about this life, this age, next age, please don't get the impression that I'm at all conveying that anything in this life, the physical material goods that God has given us, please don't hear me say that they are evil or trying to denigrate them in any kind of form. It's not about that. God said that creation was good, so it's good. I think this passage is arguing that although this is good, there's better, if that makes sense. This is good, but there's better. So Abraham, even though he was surrounded by this good stuff that God had given him, and presumably enjoying it, that wasn't enough. Even all that material, physical abundance was not enough. Because it wasn't home. It wasn't home. And that's interesting. And his experience of being in material abundance and receiving all this blessing is a contrast with many other examples that we read of. So this hard-going passage here about not so much women receiving back their dead by resurrection, but people being tortured. They're not accepting their release. People who are mocked and flogged, chains, imprisonment, stoned, sawn in half, etc., wandering around. This is a list, again, from Jewish, Hebrew, Old Testament, and I think the period between the Old and New Testament period as well, people who were martyred for their faith. And I presume also people who weren't just martyred for their faith, but also people who were killed when the Jewish nation was overtaken by Romans, by Greeks, etc., etc. But God's people who had suffered through history in real time as well. And again, reading this stuff, it seems like a different world because in so many ways it was. It can seem quite barbaric. No doubt some of this stuff is still unfortunately happening in just other parts of the world that we don't even know about. But it's a very different experience than what Abraham had. So Abraham had all this material blessing and he still didn't regard it as home. These people suffered in this world and they didn't regard it ultimately as home. So it's a good place just to pause for a second and take stock. Now I've got examples of people having faith in this glorious future despite life being good in the here and now. So that's Abraham and his immediate descendants. And we have examples of people having faith despite life being abject misery, on the run, living in holes, so to speak, being persecuted and eventually martyred. So this, to me at least, this proves the point that faith, this faith, however we define it, is not dependent upon material circumstances. Whether you're rich and having a great life or whether you're poor and on the run. And it's important because, again, this kind of shoots down that argument about religion or faith being the opium of the people. This is saying that it's not just for people who are having a tough life. Secondly, if you look at verse 39, again, none of these people received what was promised. They all died, still seeing that the fulfillment of that hope was still to come. Why wasn't it fulfilled? In some real profound reason, their hope wasn't fulfilled. They didn't see the end of those promises because of us, the people here in this room. So if you look at verse 39 again closely, they did not receive what was promised because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. Apart from us, here in the present, they, the people in the past, would not be made perfect. What does that mean? In his wisdom, God's big point, his big goal for history, for human history, has been reconciling peoples to himself, restoring the broken and busted up relationships between humanity and himself. He wants to live with people again. He wants to dwell among them. He wants to live with them in this eternal city that we've been hearing about through Hebrews. And we believe this was achieved by the life, death, resurrection and ascension of Jesus, both God and man. So Jesus doing what he did meant that this offer of reconciliation was more readily available to all people. Really importantly, not just a family, not just a tribe, not just an ethnic group, not just a nation, but readily available to all peoples, including Tasmanians. Maybe even including mainlanders. Maybe. Because believe it or not, this variety and spectrum of people, it brings God more glory. There's something about the variety and the differences between people's groups and their cultures when they're all oriented back towards God and praising him. It brings God more glory. He loves that. So these examples we've been reading about from the Old Testament, they all lived before the time of Christ, before that plan could be completed or fulfilled. But now, after Jesus, it has been completed and fulfilled. And that's what made perfect means here. It doesn't mean morally perfect. It doesn't mean ethically perfect. It means finished, completed, or fulfilled. So putting that all together, that's faith in the Hebrew sense, I think. So my rough definition, if you're looking at what faith means in the book of Hebrews, is this: a certainty and desire. So again, it's both that knowing with your head, but also feeling in your being, felt in and shaping the here and now. So you actually had that in the here and now. And that certainty and desire is that God's promised glorious future will come to pass in the next age. In the next age. It is coming. And that drastically affects how we live in the here and now, the present. And we see this kind of faith exemplified by all those characters through chapter 11, which makes you wonder, so what is the big point of that list? What is the point of all these examples? And we read a bit about the answer to that at the start of chapter 12. And this makes sense to me because we humans, we are unique in at least a few ways compared to the rest of the species. And one of them, I think, one of the unique ways that we're different is our propensity to be super social. So other species are social, but compared to humans, from what I've read and understood, we are super social. We're a whole nother level. We organise, we mimic, we emulate, we understand, and we need other people more than any other species. So examples are really useful for us. Examples inspire us, they encourage us, and they remind us of truths. They make otherwise seemingly impossible things plausible, because I've seen an example of someone else being able to do it. Examples give us the proverbial kick in the butt when we need it. They remind us of who we really are. That's what these examples from Hebrews 11 can do for us. And the supreme example that we read of in chapter 12 of Jesus. He helps us endure, to not lose heart or grow weary. So to wrap up, some super quick ideas around application. If you don't consider yourself a Christian this morning, and maybe not even a spiritual seeker, welcome. It's great to have you here. We've heard of people who had the good life here on earth, like Abraham, but even then they weren't satisfied. They desired something more than even the best of life could offer them. And that kind of provokes me to ask the question, do I have anything in my life that is more important than life? Do I have anything in my life that I actually consider more important than life, this life itself? And if not, wouldn't you like to have something in life that you actually consider more important than life? Do you ever find yourself despairing, or at least slightly discouraged, when you found yourself in a position where you've chased down and achieved those goals that you set in life that you thought were going to make you happy and satisfied, only to discover after you've actually achieved them that they're overrated? Getting what you want and finding that it doesn't live up is almost, I think, worse than never getting in the first place. This passage is suggesting that your intuitions are right. There is something more than just this life. And there is something that can be offered to you to help when those inevitable spiritual struggles cross your path. There's a way to make sense of that, or at least to start making sense of that. So that can be worth considering. Or if you're not sure about Christianity, but you're curious, then let me encourage you to persevere in seeking God. We've read this morning that God rewards those who pursue him. Give this the time and the dedication that it deserves. But don't just take it from me. This book is a New York Times bestseller from last year. It's called Strength to Strength, From Strength to Strength. It's not a Christian book. It's a mainstream book. The author was a midlife convert to Catholicism and also has some past interest in Buddhism. And this is the advice that he gave to his mostly middle-aged, successful professional readers in the context of how to live a meaningful and fulfilling life. This is what he wrote. To practice faith requires time and effort. There's no getting around this. The solution here is to stop seeing your spiritual development as a side interest, but rather to put it front and centre. If I told you you had some serious health problem requiring that you exercise half an hour a day and take some medicine, you would do it. Well, your spiritual development is that important. You must make time by scheduling your meditation, prayer, reading and practice every day. Every day. And again, this is a mainstream book aimed at a mainstream audience, a mainstream non-religious audience. And I think he's right. If you're seeking, don't stop. Don't shrink back. Instead, if anything, follow this guy's advice, double down on your efforts. Take this seriously. Pray for more or any faith. Pray for the desire to desire God. Pray that God will reveal more of himself to you. And lastly, if you consider yourself a Christian here, then please remain as face-to-face involved as you can in the life of the church. And I'm not just talking Sunday mornings, I'm talking small groups, cot jobs, working bees, quiz nights, one-on-one coffees, prayer triplets or whatever. Months ago, Alistair preached on the passage from chapter 10 of Hebrews about not giving up the habit of meeting together and instead encouraging one another daily. Last week I spoke on the risks of consistently and deliberately turning our back on God and his design for our lives, and suggested that a way that this can often happen is by not regularly seeing and encouraging each other. And today we've heard all about the importance of examples. All this seems to tell me at least that we need the inspiration, the encouragement, the accountability of other examples. We need to be reminded that we're part of a lineage, if you like. The people who you read about here, they're our people. We need the supreme example of Jesus. But as Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote back in the 30s and 40s, I need you to remind me of Jesus. I need you to almost be a little Jesus to me, to show me his love through your love and encouragement. I need your stories of by faith to help me endure. I need you to help remind me that as difficult as this life could be, or as absolutely fantastic as this life could be, this life is not the end. It's not the end. This isn't my ultimate home. And again, this is an endurance event, but it's a team-based one. That is, we run this endurance event side by side together and often face to face. And that's the only way that we'll get through it successfully, I think, and with God's grace. So let me pray. Father, I thank you for working in history. I thank you that through the real lives of other people, so similar to us in so many ways, but also so different, you show us these great examples of persisting, of enduring, even through really good, fantastic circumstances that could so easily distract us, all the way through to hideous, harrowing circumstances where it'd be just so easy to despair and give up on following you. And I thank you once again that you've given us each other to help in this task, as well as all these good examples of the past. And I pray more and more your Spirit will be working with ours, just to help shape our hearts and help us realise just how interdependent we are when it comes to this venture of following you. You haven't left us to do it alone. You don't want us to do it alone. But in your wisdom and your providence and power, you've placed us side by side with people to journey with. And I thank you for that, Father, and I pray that you'll just help remind us of this great truth and just let us never take it for granted. Amen.